All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the first session of the spring webinar series, which is Differentiation and High Ability Learners. And we are so excited to have Kristy, Feden and Claudine Kennicut from the Nebraska MTSS team. Kristy is in region 1 and 2, and Claudine is in region 4. And we are going to be talking today about database decisions and differentiation for high ability learners within your MTSS system. So just a couple of things. If you guys have questions, feel free to, stop us. Feel free to drop them in the chat. Let us know if you need us to clarify anything. Also, if you need to pop in or out, just go ahead and shut your camera off and keep your microphone on mute, please. And other than that, we're going to have a lot of fun, and we are really excited to share this information with you guys today. So we are going to go ahead and get started. Also, we are recording, so if you don't want to be on the recording, just go ahead and shut off your camera. So we're going to start really basic with a baseline of who are high ability learners in the first place. And so by definition for Nebraska Rule 3, which is the rule that governs high ability learners, you can see here that it's a student who has high performance capability that includes intellectual domains, creative, artistic, specific academic fields. And this is someone who requires some kind of accelerated program or curriculum in order to develop their talents. And the National Association for Gifted Children defines a high ability learner or a gifted child as someone who has those talents or has the potential to perform at those levels. So when we're thinking about high ability learners, we want to think about not only who is already performing there, but who has those capabilities to perform at a higher level. Some characteristics of high ability learners. These ones are pretty easy to spot. You see them in the classroom all the time. They're your kiddos who pick up really quickly, verbal proficiency, so they're having conversations at a level that is well above their grade. They oftentimes prefer relationships with older children or adults because they are seeking that intellectual match and that stimulation. Oftentimes they can have an unusual imagination. It's often overexcited, overactive, and really in depth with their games that they're making up or other things that they're doing. They're really imaginative. They absorb easily, memorize quickly. A lot of times they have really deep interests in single areas. So for example, if you've got, a first grader who can tell you everything in the entire world about dinosaurs because they've read all the books about dinosaurs, they're really deeply interested, that might be a sign of high ability learner. They're often creative and inventive. Something about high ability learners is that they have a lot of empathy and they're really sensitive, especially to criticism. They're often curious, have that divergent thinking. And then we also have our students who are twice exceptional, which is when a student has a disability and they also are a high ability learner. So for example, we see twice exceptionalism pretty often with autism spectrum disorder, or it can be things like I've had students who are gifted and also have a motor impairment, or gifted and have a hearing impairment. So any kind of dual exceptionality, that's what twice exceptionalism is. And then we have some characteristics of high ability learners that we see in the classroom, but we may not realize that those are characteristics of a high ability learner. So for example, students may become bored with their general classroom tasks, and this can lead to refusal of doing work or not turning in work, or just, again, flat out, just, I'm not doing this, it's not worth my time, if it's redundant or boring to them. They may have difficulty changing topics because when they get on something and they're really single-tracked and interested, it can be hard to get them off of that. They often are impatient, and so their peer interactions may not be very beneficial for everyone. They often don't understand why peers aren't learning as fast as them and why they don't understand like they do, or why they don't want to talk about what they want to talk about, and so it causes that impatience. They often question adult direction, which can be seen as insubordination, but it really is truly because they want to know why they're doing what they're doing, and they want to understand the whole product instead of just step by step. They want to know what is their end goal, what is their product going to be. They often have that need for stimulation. They're emotionally sensitive, and they can have that difficulty with authority because they are, often the smartest in their class. And so they're the one that feels like they know everything. And so that can also come off as difficult with authority. They're usually pretty dominant in group work or with other peer groups. They're kind of seen as like maybe the bossy kid, or they just want to get it done and do it right. And so they just take over. Again, they frequently talk with the teacher because they want that intellectual stimulation. High ability learners may suffer from or may have perfectionistic tendencies, which can turn into neurotic perfectionism if we do not give them strategies. And they also develop asynchronously. So their intellectual age and their chronological age often don't match. And so they can intellectually understand things that maybe emotionally they're not ready for, or maybe they have these really awesome creative ideas and they're 6, so they can't write as fast as they're thinking, and they have these different asynchronous tendencies that can be frustrating. High ability learners really do require support beyond the general education curriculum because academics matter. It's important to note that a lot of times there was a study done by Joe Renzulli and Sally Reese, and they found that when teachers eliminated 40 to 50% of the mastered curriculum and allowed those students to work on accelerated material, they did not score lower than the children who went through the entire curriculum. So 50% of curriculum is really not needed for high ability learners. And that opens up so many opportunities if we can compact that all down and give them an opportunity to work on something accelerated or in their talent area. Not all high ability students need the same supports either. We have some students that may be really great at math and they're not so great at ELA, or they're really gifted in ELA and not so great at math, or there are varying levels of giftedness. And so not all high ability learners need to be stuck into the same category, receiving the same services, because they're all unique and they have different needs.
And so just like this image shows, this can feel like a puzzle or a maze of some sort, trying to determine how best to support this population of students. How do we make sure that we're meeting their individual needs? And we do this through a multi-tiered system of support framework. And a lot of times you think of MTSS as supports for students that might be struggling, and how do we make sure that they are getting intensified instruction? But we've really got to look at this population of students too in the same way. How are we making sure that they are receiving the education that best fits with them? So the goal of that is a true partnership, streamlining all of those systems, working together, and not seeing this process as something separate. It all fits into your existing multi-tiered system of support. And many of your districts already have problem-solving systems in place to support students. We just need to extend that same way of thinking to this particular population of students. So in alignment with the Nebraska Department of Education's mission of equity for all students, our Nebraska MTSS mission is to empower schools to support and prepare all Nebraska learners for success, which includes students and their teachers. And these multi-tiered systems of support are sometimes thought of as another thing for schools to do, but that truly is not it. It's the way schools should be doing business. It's a sustainable, continuous school improvement process. And within this multi-tiered system of support, the focus is on the whole child, the academic side, along with the social emotional needs, as well as the behavioral needs of all students. And so Nebraska MTSS is that framework that promotes the integrated system, connecting general education and special education, along with all of the components of teaching and learning in that high quality, standards-based instruction and intervention system that matches to those students' academic, social, emotional, and behavior needs, whether it is students that are struggling or students that need those extension activities. So the map that you see on your screen right now is what our regional teaming looks like. It is a statewide support team with a strong emphasis placed on the equity of resources and services. So this is our current structure for the division of our regions and which ESUs are supported within each of these areas. And underneath the map, you can also see some of our statewide support team. And we truly believe in the concept of teaming and bringing all entities together to support all levels within our school systems, from the district level down to the individual student. And when we're talking about this population of students, we need to make sure that we're doing individual problem solving. You'll be able to see on the next few slides how we've been able to collaborate and continue building our framework of support with various partnerships. So as our team and implementation has continued to build out statewide, we have been very intentional about expanding our partnerships with other educational entities. And this slide shows a lot of those that we have. Department of Education, we've partnered with Sheyanne for quite a while now and have really thoroughly enjoyed that relationship we've been able to build. Pyramid, Nebraska PBIS, we have also added the Nebraska Autism Network as a partner as well. And our goal is really to reduce redundancy and align MTSS with our collaborative partners so that every school in our state is able to work smarter and not harder to provide for all students with all ability levels. And so we really feel that it's important for districts to recognize these connections. So we're going to just briefly look at a couple of different definitions. So when we start thinking about high ability learning and how it fits into our MTSS framework, we want to take a moment to differentiate between response to intervention and a multi-tiered system of support. So MTSS has been defined by our Nebraska Builders, which is a group of stakeholders from across the state, and they meet quarterly and are comprised of individuals from all different educational levels, from classroom instructors to building administrators, collegiate level, representation within our ESUs, and also state level individuals. And you can see a distinct difference between these two definitions. And as many of you are already aware, RTI has been seen in the past as practices used to determine eligibility for special education. Whereas MTSS is an instructional system in which all students receive strong core instruction in academics, as well as behavioral and social emotional supports, with the potential for high quality interventions of increasing intensity. And since our focus today is on high ability learners, the same process applies. Districts need to continue advocating for this population of students by increasing the intensity of their instruction for students who are high achieving and need extensions beyond the core curriculum. This next slide is a representation of what has been happening for some time in education. And we've been operating in these silos for years. And MTSS is focused on breaking down those silos, the all hands on deck approach to education. It's not just general education or special education or high ability learning, but rather integrated initiatives, streamlining our efforts and supporting our district personnel to work collaboratively. And as you saw on the previous definition of MTSS, it's an integrated system, an educational framework for continuous improvement, problem solving, and decision making. And this truly does happen at all levels. And one of our biggest messages is all truly does mean all within a multi-tiered system of support. It's not the shiny new penny. It is the way we do business. And so we'd like to show you briefly the components of our deeply implemented multi-tiered system of support. And we refer to these 6 elements as our essential elements, or the building blocks, foundational pieces, whatever you'd like to call them, to the system. This can also be thought of the backbone as our work. And these essential elements were identified by the Nebraska builders. And it's important to notice as you're looking through maybe some of the titles on those, not one of those is more important than the other. They are all critical components of a deeply implemented multi-tiered system of support. And we utilize those and share a lot of different messages based on our 6 essential elements. And when we talk about MTSS, we wouldn't be able to get by without having some sort of a pyramid to show you today, right? But we want to talk about the all, some, few system or idea of MTSS, and would like to show you this visual. It explains how all students must initially have access to core instruction with specifically designed instruction of increasing intensities to support the needs of students. So as their needs increase, whether that's students that are struggling or the students we're talking about today that already have that core knowledge, that instruction and intervention must be specifically designed to meet their needs. And this is in addition to their core, not instead of core instruction. Any one student may need additional support at any one point in time across the tiers. And if we're having consistent problem-solving meetings where we're looking at student data and collaborating as grade level teams, we are much more able to address these students in a more timely way. And so specially designed instruction is ongoing and happening throughout these tiers. And we recognize that these interventions of increasing intensity are not just for students struggling with core instruction, but definitely for those high ability students who need more challenging curriculum and instruction. And so this leads us right into a discussion about how this intensified instruction can apply to those high ability learners. And so we really want to focus on what this looks like for those students. How do we support this particular demographic of our student population? And Sheyanne is going to take us through this next section on what instruction could look like for this population of students. Questions to consider: how do we meet the needs of our students who already have that content knowledge? And what could these extension activities of increasing intensity look like?
So we're going to look briefly at this bell curve. And as you see, there's a quote up there from Scott Pfeiffer, who is a psychologist, and he specializes in gifted assessment. And he says, the point is this: individual differences do matter, even among the gifted. They matter a great deal at the upper end of the continuum. So if we look at this bell curve, which is of normal distribution, usually we think of high ability learners somewhere around 2 standard deviations above the average. And so that's somewhere around here in the 125 to 130 IQ range. So when we think about the other end of normal distribution, when we think about servicing students who are struggling, or maybe students that have a disability, we don't give the same services to somebody that's 2 standard deviations below the average as we would somebody who is 3 standard deviations below the average. It's the same exact thing for high ability learners. The students who have this 130 IQ and 2 standard deviations above are going to need something a little different than the students who have that profoundly gifted IQ that are in that 3rd and above standard deviation range. And the most common view of high ability learners is that once they're identified as, we have this arbitrary line of gifted, not gifted, and once they're identified as gifted, they all become the same, and they're all in the same category. And so we really want to think about high ability learners on a continuum with varying levels and strengths. And so this is kind of what that might look like. So when we think about making these connections with students, we want to think about, again, that problem solving model and that how can we go from core instruction, and when we see need for increasingly intensive interventions, what might that look like for high ability learners? So for example, in this bottom tier, which is core, a lot of high ability learners, teachers will need to do the classroom level differentiation, that compacting where we take out their mastered material, using those extracurricular opportunities such as FFA and 4-H and Quiz Bowl, and using those honors and AP classes. So in the core, that really does do a lot of good for high ability learners. But we do have those kiddos who still need additional challenge. So when we see that maybe they're not quite responding as well as we would like in that core level, they need more intervention, we move up to the next level. And that's where we see some of these more specialized high ability services. A lot of individualized pull-out sessions, like when the gifted teacher comes in and takes their group of students and they have them for an hour, that's kind of that individualized pull-out instruction. More specialized curriculum. So for example, the Jacob's Ladders or the William and Mary curriculum units that are specifically designed for high ability learners. Maybe they need that entirely different curriculum. That's a new challenge. Or maybe mentorships are for our high school kids are really great to use as well. And so we have that next level of support. And then we have that 1% of the 1% at the top that are those 3 standard deviations above the average, and they're profoundly gifted. And they may need some really intensive interventions such as whole grade acceleration, subject acceleration, intensive independent studies. So we have this continuum of services for that all-some few. And we know that high ability learners a lot of times are put into one group and they're there, and no matter what they're doing, how they're performing, they're all just usually somewhere in that middle tier of individualized curriculum, and we don't go back and evaluate if what we're doing is working. And so being able to understand these increasing interventions is really useful when we are looking at what is best for a high ability learner as an individual student instead of as a group of students. So this is a chart that kind of lays out those different instructional strategies. And so over here on the left, it is the service type and what tier it is in, where the service generally takes place and who delivers the service, and then a short description of the service. So again, for example, in this core level, in the general education classroom, we can do that curriculum compacting, and those students can use the additional time with the standards that they've mastered in order to do an independent study that's more difficult or is in their talent area. As we move up, again, we see that most of these tier 2 services are going to take place in a small group setting with a HOW facilitator or somebody who is trained. And that is another example is that pull out by subject. We see that a lot as a program model where they do that pull out enrichment with their high ability learners. And then the very, very few students who may need these intensive interventions that are usually individual. HOW facilitator is usually someone ww does these, but all these decisions a lot of times are also made by administrators. Things such as acceleration, distance learning when appropriate, they can approve those intensive mentorships and those different things. And so this is just laying out what was on that pyramid in a way that's quick and digestible.
All right. Well, if you need a stretch break after all of that information, feel free to stand and stretch and kind of ponder all of the things that we just shared. And I would invite anyone who has any questions or thoughts on what we just discussed. Well, we'll pause a minute and see if you want to come off mute and feel free to ask. My favorite thing in the world is wait time on Zoom. So I've decided, not really. So we know that was a lot of content. And what we want to do is to really put a context to it around thinking about how do we get to this point where we're able to make some of those individualized decisions and thinking about how we meet the needs of all kids. So we have two components here that we want to share before we shift into talking a little bit about data. And what you see on your screen here is kind of our hallmark or our cornerstone of our work in MTSS and in developing a system of support for all learners and all students. So on the left, you see our problem solving model, and it's through problem solving, whether it's talking about students who maybe are not achieving where we would like them to be achieving, or the students that Sheyanne was just describing, who are above where we would expect students to be at a particular grade level. It's through that problem solving process that we really engage our colleagues and that we're able to address and meet the needs effectively of students. So at the heart of our system is the problem solving model that you see on the left. And for those of you who've been through our system training, or if you have districts that have gone through MTSS system training, we encourage you to develop your own model that is specific to your district. But it's nothing more than a model if you don't have a framework to actually use and implement that problem solving process. So we also know there's an infrastructure component, and even for HAL teachers and for our staff who are supporting students who are high ability or high achieving students, it's important for them to be part of that problem solving process. So we have the problem solving model on one hand, and on the right, you will see our tool shed is how we refer to this image that you see. And this is a representation of the evidence-based tools and practices that your teams have available to meet the needs of students and to support the staff within your district. So you'll see below the house or the tool shed, you'll see foundational practices. So this might include your policies and procedures for identifying students who are high achievers or high ability learners. And then you have in the middle section, you have core practices, or those practices that are available for all learners and for all students. And as Claudine mentioned earlier, this is an integration of academic and social, emotional, and behavioral. And then in the top of the tool shed, you see those interventions of increasing intensity. And Sheyanne showed you the triangle, and Claudine also showed a triangle, both of which were intentionally gradient and didn't have really rigid tiers, because that represents the fact that we have students that can move pretty fluidly throughout those layers of intensity, depending on need. So these are the two key components. And we know with evidence-based practices, it doesn't matter if you are working with house students, if you're working with English learners, title, all of our students deserve and need evidence-based practices that are intentionally designed to meet their specific needs. So we're going to talk a little bit about the actual process itself and how we might utilize data, but we wanted to give you these two key components because they do apply to our work with high ability learners as well. So on the next slide here, you are going to see, we're going to introduce data-based problem solving and decision making. And this is where I make my disclaimer that I am a school psychologist by trade, and I love data. So I really hope you all cleared your calendar until about 7 o'clock tonight, because I'm joking. We're not going to talk about it that long. It's going to be quick and down and dirty. But if you do have questions after we go through this, we'll be available for some follow-up. So I think a really key component that I'm really excited about our work in collaborating with Sheyanne is this statement right here. Not all house students need the same support. And I think what we have seen, and this applies to multiple student groups, not just house students, we have a one-size-fits-all program. And we know that that isn't what our students need, and it can become quite frustrating and may not even align with what we need to move the needle forward and to help our kids achieve and succeed. So you can see here, one of the first steps is helping our teams to have a common understanding or a common language around the students that we're actually talking about in our problem solving. So this chart just provides an example of how teams might begin to develop that common understanding or that common language around skills that students need. And this helps with that differentiation piece. So are we talking about foundational skills, which is actually a student that might be needing or missing content from previous grade levels? Or are we talking about extension skills? So those are the students that Sheyanne was discussing that have already mastered or already understand the content that's within those grade level expectations, and they need to move forward, or they need to have that opportunity to progress. So that's really important. And how do we identify where kids fall within this continuum? We do that through database problem solving and decision making. And so on this slide, whether or not you use the terminology PLC, which is a professional learning community, it's irrelevant, so to speak, because we're talking about problem solving teams. But what we've done is we really appreciate and adapt the questions that the DeFors have put forth in their PLC training. These 4 critical questions transcend any teaming structure that you have in your district. So we focus in teaming. We want to know, what do we want all students to know and be able to do, right? We have to have that common understanding of what those expectations are for that particular grade level. How are we going to know if they've learned it? So that's where we get into those discussions about data and about assessments and all of the rich information we have available to support students. How are we going to respond for those kids that didn't learn the content or that don't have those skills that we need? And what we're focusing on this afternoon is this 4th question: how will we extend the learning for students who are already proficient? And we understand and appreciate, we have all worked in the schools for many, many years, and we understand that teams feel incredibly compelled to really focus on that 3rd bullet, right? That's where our hearts are. We want to help students. We want to help children. And so we can't let that, though, be the detriment to the students that fall within that 4th bullet. We need to have systems of support that are adaptable and responsive to all students. So on the next slide, we are going to, again, reiterate one of the tools and one of the structures or systems that you need to have in place to be able to answer those questions. And we talk a lot at the districts, with districts in our system training about a balanced assessment system. And we won't go into that in depth today, but the balanced assessment system is what allows you to identify those students who might be varying in some way and shape and form from that grade level expectation. So you have screeners, you have diagnostic tools to help you kind of hone in on specific skills. Progress monitoring is key, and it's a key element of that problem solving model that we just talked about. And then finally, we have outcome measures that are available. So this is a snapshot of kind of the key components of a balanced assessment system within a district. But on the next slide, Sheyanne's going to talk a little bit more about what a balanced assessment system might look like specific to our focus on house students. So I'll turn it back over to you, Sheyanne.
Yeah, so I took those same assessment types, and a lot of you have districts that have an identification system in place. And so these top 2 bullets or these top 2 assessment types are when you refer a student for screening, or if you guys use a universal screener, or if you see a kiddo in your class that you want to refer for high ability learning, these are the data points they're going to look at. So in the top, we have universal screening, which I know a lot of schools do. A lot of schools administer the COGAT. I know there are schools that do the OLSAT. The Naglieri nonverbal assessment is really popular for identifying students of non-English speaking backgrounds. The Ravens progressive matrices, etc. There are a lot of universal screeners. The COGAT is the most common, and those are used to screen at the very beginning. Then they pull those scores of those students who scored in whatever they set their bar at, those students and above. And a lot of times they go into the diagnostic. And so they pull up their MAP scores and their NSCAS scores, and a lot of times administer a individual IQ assessment. So that could be the Woodcock-Johnson, Stanford-Binet, WISC-5. They will also ask for diagnostic data from the teacher, usually via a rating scale. They'll ask the student for self-rating or interest inventories. They'll ask for classroom performance a lot of times, and sometimes we do a portfolio of all of this diagnostic information together to get a better picture of the child. But today, when we're talking about programming for high ability learners, we're looking at that progress monitoring and outcome measures. And this is something that really gets lost in there with high ability learners. So progress monitoring is the key. We need to make sure we're continually observing and looking at their performance, staying in communication with their families and teachers so that it's clear if they're not being appropriately challenged. That could mean too much challenge or too little challenge. We want to make sure that we are looking at growth. So if we want to make sure we're looking at MAP growth. If they started in the 99th percentile, if they're not being fed at that level, they're not going to make growth. They're going to regress. So we want to make sure that while they may be at the top of the grade level, that they're still getting that opportunity to go above and beyond. Progress monitoring for high ability learners. Again, collecting data is a little more tricky for high ability learners than it is for special education evaluations, because there's not a set score, or you're not trying to get them to this standard. We're really trying to push the ceiling up. And so observations and anecdotal data are really important for progress monitoring, because the teacher can see if the student is struggling with the challenging material or if they need more. Also, if you ask a high ability learner, they'll tell you. They will tell you, this is too hard, I don't like this. Or they'll tell you, this is boring, this isn't hard enough. And so that's honestly part of it, is being in communication with the student. Looking at classroom performance is important as well, especially for students. We're looking at acceleration, grade skipping, those kinds of things. We want to make sure if we accelerate them, they're continuing to perform well in class and it's not detrimental and they need to slide back down. Parent input is huge, because the parent sees what the child's doing at home, the parent hears what the child is saying. And so being in communication with the parents is also really important, because they will tell you their perspective on their child's challenge in school. And a lot of times parents know better than we do in schools what their child needs. And then finally, outcome measures. So when we are looking at the differentiated products that high ability learners are doing, a lot of times those are independent studies, or if they're being grade skipped, we want to make sure we're continuing to look at their outcomes. So example, if a student is doing an independent project in that core tier and you have an evaluation, you have a rubric, and it seems as if it was not appropriately challenging, then we can say maybe they need something more intensive at this point. And if we're looking at grade skipping, again, we want to make sure we're keeping track of their grades, and we want to make sure that we're keeping track of their growth measures to ensure these students are continually growing and not stagnating or regressing.
So again, our main point today is really to think about how are we measuring whether or not we know what we're doing is working. And that comes through that reflect phase of the problem solving process, where, we've gone through all of this work and we've identified students who meet our criteria for HAL programming. We've identified an intervention or support for that particular student, but do we have the mechanisms in place to go back and reflect to see whether or not what we're doing is actually working? So I like the chart that Sheyanne had pulled together with some of the potential data sources. And this is where I think we, when we're thinking back to that slide that Claudine shared in regard to breaking down silos, we want to make sure that we have our specialists and those of you who have such a broad depth of knowledge and experience working with students who need that differentiation, that you're part of these problem solving teams. And I know that problem solving and teaming structures look different in districts depending on the size of your district, but I would really challenge all of us to think about ways to incorporate your knowledge and expertise into those particular teams. Because we also know that there's going to be many students who don't necessarily meet the criteria for HAL, but who are achieving. And if you go back to that fourth bullet of the DeFore questions, they've already mastered content. So how are we going to challenge, and how are we going to continue to provide them what they need to move forward and to make that progress? So those reflection stages are what we wanted to really have you ponder today. And I would invite, if any of you have experienced, a really either examples or any thoughts on the progress monitoring component and how we can really build this out in our state and in our school districts, I'm going to pause. We would love to hear your thoughts on that piece. Really, how are we reflecting for our kids that are in HAL programming or high achievers? You can chat or you can come off mute, whatever you're most comfortable with. Or here's a question too. How many of you are on your problem solving teams? Is anyone part of that? Ah, Mandy, awesome. You're on the SAT team. Wonderful. Oh, and Denise is excellent. Oh, and Melissa, yeah, awesome. So we think about that cycle and, the beauty of problem solving. Oh, thank you, Abby. The beauty of the problem solving process is we don't go in with preconceived notions about the direction that our conversations are going to turn when we're engaging in that, that ongoing continuous improvement cycle where we're having conversations about students. We know that students' needs can shift. As Sheyanne mentioned, you might have a student that really masters one particular area, but they struggle in another. And so having your expertise at the table, I think is tremendous. And that's what we're really hoping to gain through our partnership is really bringing this awareness to the MTSS process and to the problem solving process in making sure that we have the right players at the table to really truly be able to meet the needs of all students. And then that team also becomes a sounding board for all of you who are working with a group of students that are receiving specific intervention and specific supports where we can, come back and revisit whether or not what we're doing is working. So excellent. Great. Thank you all so much.
So we're going to do something that I know is everyone's favorite, which is put you in breakout rooms momentarily. So we're going to do some practice. I've written a scenario, and your task is to decide based on the different data that I've provided, what tier you would place this student in and why. What services do you think this student needs? So I'm going to go ahead and flip to the slide and read you the scenario, and then I'm going to put you in breakout rooms and give you a few minutes to discuss. And then somebody from your breakout room is going to need to share out. So please elect that person, draw straws beforehand. All right. So Sarah is a 6th grade student. She was recently identified as a HOW learner there. After noticing that she was scoring in the 99th percentile on INSCAS social studies, her teacher recommended her for the HOW program. On an individually administered IQ test, she scored a 145, which is 3 standard deviations above the average on the bell curve, on verbal comprehension. Her quantitative and visual spatial scores were in the above average range. Additionally, she was performing above grade level on the reading map. Her ELA teacher noticed that Sarah often finishes her work in about half the time it takes her classmates, and when she's finished, she quietly gets out her book and reads. In math, her teacher reports she regularly grasps the concepts, but she is struggling with completing her homework with accuracy, averaging about an 85%. Sarah's history teacher notes that she is exceptional in class and she is often drawn to social justice issues. She appears to be passionate and she is an exceptional writer. She recently used her writing to persuade the principal to start an LGBTQ+ after-school club. Sarah's ELA and history teachers report that they often probe Sarah's thinking and add complexity to her assignments, but she does not seem to be challenged. Yes, Kristy, thank you for dropping the link to the slide. So if you guys need to read this again, it will be in the slides. I'm going to put you in breakout rooms for just 5 minutes and let you guys discuss this. And go. Welcome back. Does anybody want to share out something that your group had said about this situation, this scenario?
I can go if nobody else wants to go. we had looked at this, and right off you could see that this person could fit really in all 3 tiers, because with her social justice piece, a mentorship, she might need great acceleration in reading. However, in the math area, that's not where she's demonstrating. She might even be behind. And this is all sounds really well and good, except the reality is that she would just sit in class and read and struggle and whatever, because that is the structure that is put in place in our communities today. Like, it would be great to do it, but there's nothing behind it to make it happen.
Thank you for sharing. And I had mentioned with another breakout room that this one of the really great things about MTSS is that there's already a system that exists. And so if we can plug into that system instead of reinventing the wheel, this is a really great place to insert into an already existing system. And so it's going to take time, but that's our hope. But thank you for sharing. Anybody else's group have anything else?
We talked about it in our group, and I think Melissa had a really good point about that she would fit in that core tier 1 as a compacting the curriculum, because something Melissa mentioned, like a National History Day competition, to focus on those strengths she has in history and writing would be pretty powerful for her. So rather than adding something, I think Scott mentioned the term also layering on top of what she already has instead of adding, and to be able to compact the curriculum that way.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that, for sharing out those thoughts. I was popping around to breakout rooms and hearing so many just awesome conversations about how we can use these different things to help students. Again, like Angie had pointed out, not just sit in class and be bored. There are ways to do this. And so as you evaluated this situation and you took in all the data, and you guys were completely right, there's a spectrum of services, again, that gradient of services that she would be eligible for, especially based on her differing talent areas, which are social studies, ELA, kind of that social justice side, versus the visual spatial math side. And so we have this data, and as a team we have to make a decision. And so as an update, like we said, it's really important to come back and revisit our decisions. So this team decided that they were going to put Sarah in tier 1 for supports. So she was being pre-assessed. You guys were right on the nose with, she was being curriculum compacted, and she is were allowed to work on her independent project in lieu of her class assignments. After a couple of months of collecting new data, her parents report that she is enjoying the new work but still feels bored. Her ELA teacher noted that she turned in her differentiated independent study assignment 3 weeks early and received a 95% on the predetermined rubric. Her history teacher reports that she has been experiencing a healthy struggle with her history independent project and feels it is appropriately challenging. So the team made a decision. We're going back and reflecting with new data. I'm going to invite people to come off of mute and maybe give their thoughts as to what you would recommend doing with this new data.
I think this is a perfect opportunity for collaboration between the ELA and history teacher. I know when I worked in PLC, sometimes we gave the same project or we made slightly different changes and we had completely different outcomes. So then we would talk about what those differences were in the same assignment, and then the project became better because we worked together as a PLC.
Yes, teaming. We love teaming. What are some other recommendations that you would do with this new data? Would you will Sarah continue to stay in her current services, or should we update the services in some way?
I would suggest that Sarah get to have some voice in what's going on with her services.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think she would be like, especially with her project that she already started a group. So where can you put that passion into action with somebody that is a mentor, whether in the building or in the community, because she's going to dig deeper into that. Like, she sounds interested in what she's doing in the classroom, but not deep enough that they're not just getting deep enough in there for her. So put it into action.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for your thoughts on this. Again, this is really a great highlight of those gradient of services of how do we continue to make sure what we're doing is working, instead of just saying you're a health student, you receive these services, regardless of whether they are effective or not. And so thank you guys for participating in this example. Any last thoughts from Kristy and Claudine before I move on to the final slide?
Only a thank you. And those of you who are already engaged in your problem solving teams, we would welcome, if you have thoughts or ideas of how we can help move this forward, we would love to hear from you. So thank you.
So on this final slide, I have a survey. If you guys could take 5 minutes to quickly fill out this survey about this session, that would be really great. If you're watching a recording, also please go fill out the evaluation for this session. It will help give us information and feedback and help inform future sessions for these webinars. So please go fill out this form. And if you have any questions, Kristy, Claudine, and I will be on for a few more minutes. And so if you have any questions or any discussions, stay on and we will be more than happy. But other than that, thank you so much for coming and giving us this hour of your time. And we hope to hear from you and soon doing these awesome things out in the field.